If you're a beginning or infrequent baker, I'm going to show you the 3 top baking secrets that are behind most baking fails so that you can have baking success. Welcome to the first episode of The Basic Baker. I'm Mike, I'm a home baker, and I want to demystify baking by demonstrating basic recipes step by step using the basic tools most people already have in their kitchen. No fancy appliances necessary. So why basic? Well, when it comes to baking, I have pretty basic tastes. I like the stuff that my grandma used to make and that probably your grandma makes, or the kinds of things that you would find at the neighborhood bakery. It's a kind of comfort baking that I love to eat and that I love to bake. So I will be baking a new recipe in every video after this one, but because this is the first episode, I do want to share those top 3 baking secrets so that you'll have a good foundation before you actually start to bake. So the secrets I'm going to talk about are: number 1, using the correct tools for baking. Second, I'm going to show you how to measure dry ingredients correctly, especially flour. And that's something that I think has messed a lot of people up. It certainly messed me up when I was first starting out. So if measuring is something that you've struggled with, hopefully after this video you will struggle no more. And third, I will show you how to set up your oven so that it works like you assume it should, but probably doesn't right now. Let's start off with the most basic of the basic, and that is a wooden spoon. There really is just no substitute. You can't use, well, you can, but if you use a metal spoon, it's gonna bend at some point, and the bowl is really not shaped the right way, and it's gonna be too thin. Plastic is gonna break. Wooden spoon is the way to go. So next is a whisk, and you usually use that for 2 different things. One is when you have a lot of different dry ingredients in a bowl, you give it a whisk to make sure that they're evenly distributed, which is important. And also, if you have a liquid mixture that you want to incorporate air into, you'll need a whisk for that. So the last necessary handheld tool is this, a silicone spatula. Sometimes you'll hear it called a rubber spatula, but they're all made of silicone, and this has changed my baking life. You can scrape every little bit of liquid out of a bowl with this, and maybe that doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you have your otherwise wonderful wooden spoon, you know it's not going to get every little bit out, and you know you've worked hard on this recipe and you want it all in the oven and not in your sink. So this is really a lifesaver. It makes sure that everything you bake is going to get baked. Also, it is the tool to use when you have to fold.
I don't know how to fold.
Don't worry, it's easy. Okay, now on to the measuring tools. I'm sure you recognize this, liquid measuring cup, no explanation needed, but you definitely should not be measuring your dry ingredients in here. It's just not designed in a way that will let you do it accurately. That's why you need these things, your dry ingredient measuring cups, and we'll go over these a little more when we talk about measuring dry ingredients, but this is a definite must-have. You can't get away without it. And same for these measuring spoons. Yeah, I'll never get a job on The Price is Right. But these are another thing that is absolutely necessary, and I'll go over that again when we talk about measuring dry ingredients. But if you want to bake, you just simply need them. Here's another tool I'm sure you have in your house, bowls, pretty basic. You can usually buy baking bowls or cooking bowls. You can use them for cooking too, but you can usually buy them at a kitchen store or wherever in a set of 3. So having a big one and 2 medium ones would be great, and then use your cereal bowl if you have to for smaller things, but at least have these 3, large, medium, small. So let's talk about things that you actually bake stuff in, your baking pans. And depending on what you bake, this could be, you could have like a whole library full of these things. But to start out with, I'm sure that you've got a couple of glass baking pans already, 9x13. That's great for cakes. My grandmother always used to make these chocolate cakes with the boiled chocolate frosting. Memories. And This, what is this, 8x8? Yeah, it's usually, you can usually find an 8x8 or 9x9 square pan. These are great for brownies. You know, depending on what you want to bake in the future, you'll just acquire a new pan for it. It's like if something breaks in your house, you get to go to the hardware store and buy a new toy. Like when I first wanted to make a bundt cake, I got myself a bundt pan. When I wanted to start making muffins, I got myself a muffin tin, and so on and so forth. So yeah, you don't have to have a whole like menagerie of baking pans. Just work with what you got, and then when you're ready to get a new one, by all means. Okay, these I find super useful, mostly because I bake cookies a lot, but they are useful for so many things: baking, cooking. Cookie sheets are cookie sheets. They're usually not as big, and they're a lot thinner, and there's no rim on them. So what happens if you're walking along and you're not exactly parallel to the floor? All your cookies go tumbling onto the floor, and then the dog gets them. Cooling racks are also pretty necessary. Like if you're baking things like cookies or muffins, you can't keep them on the pan that just came out of the oven because they're just going to keep cooking. And it's also great because they're raised off the surface of the counter, so it lets air circulate along all sides. If you grab something out of the oven and just set it down on your counter, the bottom is just going to be insulated, and it's not going to cool as quickly as all the other parts. Here is the only electric appliance that I'm going to recommend as necessary for baking. I'm sure you recognize an electric hand mixer. You probably have one already, but you could technically get away without one. You could cream butter and sugar with a wooden spoon. You could beat cream or egg whites with a whisk. But aside from giving you like totally shredded forearms, it's just going to be too much work and too much time. And we're not in Little House on the Prairie times. You certainly don't need one of those hundreds and hundreds of dollars stand mixers, but this will make your life infinitely easier, and I don't think there's really any reason to go without it. Okay, now these are a couple of edge cases, but I think they do fall on this side of necessary for baking, even though you probably won't use them that often. It's just that when you do need them, you're really going to miss them, and there's no way that you can really substitute something else for them. So this first tool, sieves, strainers, whatever you want to call them, I use them for three things. So first is usually if I have to put in some fresh squeezed lemon juice or lime juice or citrus juice into a recipe, you squeeze it and you let it strain through a strainer so that it keeps out all of the pulp and seeds. Second, sometimes a recipe will call for dry ingredients to be sifted. This doesn't really happen that much, but if somebody does put it in a recipe, I figure, well, it's in there for a reason, so I better do it. So I'm sure you've seen people on TV do this. They just dump the stuff in here and do this and sift. So it's useful for that. I bet for like a lot of these recipes where it says sift it together, you can get away without doing it, but I do it. And finally, and this isn't a necessary thing at all, but it's kind of cool. So I'm sure you've also seen on TV where a chef they'll finish a dessert and then they'll sprinkle some powdered sugar over it, and it looks all fancy and professional and like you're at a restaurant. So if you want to put on some airs, it's great to have this too. The other tool is a rasp grater or a microplane. I think that's the product name. And this again is something that, well, you could kind of substitute a very, very fine grater for, but this is like the finest grater you're ever gonna find, and it's perfect for grating citrus zest, which is just a super powerful ingredient. Just a little bit goes a long way. And also it's great for grating fresh nutmeg, which is so good. It's so much better than the stuff in the jar. And if a recipe calls for grated nutmeg, that's definitely something that's going to make a difference. So it's nice to have this and, grate that little nutmeg nut in there. This is also very efficient at grating your hand, but I don't recommend it because it hurts. A lot. So my final tool isn't really a tool, it's kind of more of an accessory, and that's parchment paper. You might think it's like wax paper. It's not like wax paper, and it's definitely not wax paper. So don't put wax paper in the oven because it's going to melt and probably catch fire and all sorts of horrible things. So parchment paper does not burn in the oven. You can line your pans with it. It keeps things from sticking. Also, it's great for cleanup too, even if you don't necessarily need a non-stick surface. Maybe you don't technically need it like you need these other things, but it's a couple bucks. It comes in really useful, and again, it's just one of those things that will make a bigger difference than you think. Now we move on to baking secret number 2, measuring dry ingredients, especially flour. Now flour is compressible, and it's not like most other dry ingredients. Most other dry ingredients you can just, scoop it right out of the bag, but not flour. Yeah, so some professional chefs on TV like Ina Garten or Julia Child, they'll just scoop flour out of a big, beautiful ceramic container that they have in their kitchen. But you probably just have a bag of flour hanging out in the cupboard. So I'm going to show you how to measure that. And besides, we're not professional chefs, so let's do it right. So some of you may be measuring out your flour the same way I did when I started out baking. And I call that the scoop and smush method. And believe me, it's not accurate. So I would just have my bag of flour, and the recipe would call for a cup. So I'd take my cup and I'd scoop it into the bag. Oh, there we go. And smush it against the side to make sure that it's level. Oh, there we go. Oh, no. Okay, come on. No, we got to do this right. So there we go. So I smush it against the side to make sure it's level. And I have a cup. It says a cup. I must have a cup. No. A cup of flour weighs 125 grams. I mean, well, some people will say 120, 122. I've always gone by 125, and I've led a full and rich life, so I don't want to get into it. But I've already zeroed out the weight of this cup measure on my scale, and let's see if smushing all this flour into this cup will give me 125 grams. No, it gave me 180 grams. That's no good. That's like, what is that, 50% more, 120? That's, okay, yeah. This is, well, look, this is the basic baker, not the basic math professor. I can Google it later, but yeah, this is about half again as much as I need. So scooping and smushing is not the way to go. The correct way to do it is the fluff and spoon and level. Fluff, spoon, level. So I'll show you how to do that now. We're still, there we go, we're still zeroed out. Okay, and I'm just going to push down this flour and compress it just to make things harder. So there's no way that this would measure out correctly right now the way it is. So what you want to do is you take a fork and you aerate your flour. I've tried it with a spoon, but it works better with a fork. So you just want to, very gently fluff it up. And now take your spoon and gently spoon it into your cup. So you don't want to be too rough when you're spooning it out of the bag, or too forceful when you're spooning it into the cup. You don't want it to compress again. So there we go. Okay, just a couple more spoonfuls. And one more. And okay. Now I'm going to level it off. Okay, all right, okay. All right, now, let's see how much we got. 128, not bad. Here, I'll show you there. Yeah, really, as long as you follow this process, it's gonna be fine. Just make sure that you're aerated plenty and you're spooning and leveling gently. Okay, now let's measure with measuring spoons. As you can imagine, it's not that hard to measure with a measuring spoon. You just take your spoon, scoop it in, level, easy. The challenge, I think, is that some people don't have measuring spoons. They don't think it's necessary because they have regular spoons in their silverware drawer, like this. And I was that way when I was starting out. I would see a teaspoon measurement or a tablespoon measurement in the recipe, and after going to Google and figuring out which was which, I would run to my silverware drawer and get the spoons. And by the way, it's easy to remember. A teaspoon is smaller than a tablespoon because a cup of tea is smaller than a table. And I figured, okay, well, I have two sizes of spoons in my silverware drawer, so this must be the teaspoon because it's smaller. This must be the tablespoon because it's bigger. And I measured my dry ingredients like that, and it was bad. Because when you're measuring with a measuring spoon, it means that you're measuring something that packs a lot of punch and that's very powerful for a small amount, like your baking soda or your baking powder. Those are leaveners, and if you're off on that, you can very easily ruin whatever you're baking. So yes, you definitely need these if you're going to bake. Let me just show you the pitfalls of measuring with your silverware spoons. Now, I'm going to use some baking soda here, and a teaspoon of baking soda weighs about 5 grams, 4 point something, 5 point something, it's kind of in the middle, but it generally turns out to 5 grams on my scale because my scale doesn't do decimals of grams. So let's see there. All right, I got 5 grams in my teaspoon. Now let's see what happens when I use my silverware teaspoon. And I have practiced this before, and my silverware teaspoon is actually kind of close to a regular teaspoon measure, but don't let that influence you in any way. You still shouldn't do this, and I'll show you why even more so in a second. But all right, so I've got, all right, that turns out as 6. So already it's too much. It's 20% too much. Look at me doing math. Now I want to test out a tablespoon. A tablespoon of baking soda should be about 15 or 16 grams. And let me do that, 17. Okay, 17. Now that's my big tablespoon. Now let me use my big silverware tablespoon and see what happens. Okay, level that off. 11 grams, 10 grams. That is way less than you need. So if you rely on your silverware spoons instead of your measuring spoons, to paraphrase South Park,
you're gonna have a bad time.
You're gonna have a bad time. Now we come to baking secret number 3, and I think it's the best kept secret in baking, at least from the point of view of amateur bakers. And that is, your oven is lying to you. So we're gonna do 2 things to make sure that you and your oven are on the same page. First, you're gonna calibrate your temperature. Easy. You take your oven thermometer, and you can get an oven thermometer probably at your grocery store, certainly at the hardware store. What you need to do is put a rack in the middle of the oven and take your oven thermometer and put that in the middle of that rack so it's perfectly in the middle of your oven. Then set your oven to 350 degrees and wait a good 20 or 30 minutes. Hopefully the temperature on your dial or on your display will be the same as the temperature on the thermometer inside the oven. And if it's not, okay, don't worry, it's easy to take care of. If you set your oven to 350, but it only comes up to 330, now you know your oven is 20 degrees cooler than what it says on the dial. So in the future, if you want to set it to 350, you actually set it 20 degrees higher to 370. I don't know why. We can put a man on the moon, but we can't build an oven that knows when it's preheated. So we'll do it like we did with the calibration of the temperature. We'll put the thermometer in the middle, on the middle rack, in the middle of the middle rack. Now this time, instead of just waiting a half hour to make sure that the dial and the internal temperature match, what we want to do is see what the temperature is when the preheat indicator goes off. And I would guarantee you that it's not going to be the right temperature. So check 10 minutes after the indicator goes off, and if it's still not at temperature, check maybe 5 minutes after that. My oven is usually at temperature 10 or 15 minutes after the preheat indicator goes off. So I always wait a good 10 or 15 minutes before putting anything into the oven. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope those 3 secrets were 3 revelations to you and will give you new encouragement to try out baking or come back to baking. And I hope you'll come and watch my second video, and that's going to be this really good, really easy brownie recipe. It's going to be a great way to ease into baking if you're nervous about it or if you're just beginning, and it's going to taste so much more complicated and sophisticated than the process actually is, and whoever you give these brownies to are going to be so impressed. So thanks again for checking out my first episode. I can't wait to start baking with you guys in my next video. So yeah, please like and subscribe and validate me, and I'll see you next time.